All right, so who is ready for Chapter 8 today? We are continuing to read in Mary Poppins by P.L. Travers and illustrated by Mary Shepard. Here at the Caribou Public Library, I'm Miss Erin, and we're here for our chapter book story time. So thanks for joining us, and we'll continue reading Mary Poppins today. Chapter 8 is called Mrs. Corry. It's a little bit longer, so we're going to read about half of it today and then finish it up next time. All right, Mrs. Corry. 2 pounds of sausages, best pork, said Mary Poppins. And at once, please, we are in a hurry. The butcher, who wore a large blue and white striped apron, was a fat and friendly man. He was also large and red and rather like one of his own sausages. He leant upon his chopping block and gazed admiringly at Mary Poppins. Then he winked pleasantly at Jane and Michael. In a hurry? He said to Mary Poppins. Well, that's a pity. I hoped you'd drop in for a bit of a chat. We butchers, you know, like a bit of company, and we don't often get the chance of talking to a nice, handsome young lady like you. He broke off suddenly, for he had caught sight of Mary Poppins' face. The expression on it was awful, and the butcher found himself wishing there was a trap door in the floor of his shop that would open and swallow him up. Oh, well, he said, blushing even redder than usual. If you're in a hurry, of course. 2 pounds, did you say? Best pork. Right you are. And he hurried, hooked down a long string of the sausages and were festooned across the shop. He cut off a length about 3/4 of a yard, wound it into a sort of garland and wrapped it up, first in white and then in brown paper. He pushed the parcel across the chopping block. And the next? He said hopefully, still blushing. There will be no next, said Mary Poppins, with a haughty sniff. She took the sausages and turned the perambulator around very quickly, and wheeled it out of their shop in such a way that the butcher knew he had mortally offended her. But she glanced at the window as she went, so that she could see her new shoes, and how her new shoes looked reflected in it. They were bright brown kid with 2 buttons, very smart. Jane and Michael trailed after her, wondering when she would have come to the end of her shopping list, but because of the look on her face, not daring to ask her. Mary Poppins gazed up and down the street, as if in deep thought, and then, suddenly making up her mind, she snapped, Fishmonger, and turned the perambulator in at the next shop to the butcher's. 1 Dover sole, 1.5 pounds of halibut, pint of prawns, and a lobster, said Mary Poppins, talking so quickly that only somebody used to taking such orders could possibly have understood her. The fishmonger, unlike the butcher, was a long, thin man, so thin that he seemed to have no front to him, but only 2 sides. And he looked so sad that you felt he had either just been weeping or was just going to. Jane said this was due to some secret sorrow that had haunted him in his youth, and Michael thought that the fishmonger's mother must have fed him entirely on bread and water when he was a baby, and that he had never forgotten it. Anything else? Said the fishmonger hopelessly, in a voice that suggested he was quite sure that there wouldn't be. Not today, said Mary Poppins. The fishmonger shook his head sadly and did not look at all surprised. He had known all along that there would be nothing else. Sniffing gently, he tied up the parcel and dropped it into the perambulator. Bad weather, he observed, wiping his eye with his hand. Don't believe we're going to get any summer at all. Not that we ever did, of course. You don't look too bloomin', he said to Mary Poppins. But then, nobody does. Mary Poppins tossed her head. Speak for yourself, she said crossly, and flounced to the door, pushing the perambulator so fiercely that it bumped into a bag of oysters. The idea, Jane and Michael heard her say as she glanced down at her shoes. Not looking too blooming in her new brown kid shoes with 2 buttons? The idea. That was what they heard her thinking. Outside on the pavement she paused, looking at her list and ticking off what she had bought. Michael stood first on one leg and then on the other. Mary Poppins, are we never going home? He said crossly. Mary Poppins turned and regarded him with something like disgust. That, she said briefly, is as it may be. And Michael, watching her fold up her list, wished that he had not spoken. You can go home if you like, she said haughtily. We are going to buy the gingerbread. Michael's face fell. If only he had managed to say nothing. He hadn't known that gingerbread was at the end of the list. That's your way, said Mary Poppins shortly, pointing in the direction of Cherry Tree Lane. If you don't get lost, she added as an afterthought. "Oh, no, Mary Poppins, no, please, I didn't mean it, really, Oh, Mary Poppins, please," cried Michael. "Do let him come, Mary Poppins," said Jane. "I'll push the perambulator if only you'll let him come." Mary Poppins sniffed. "If it wasn't Friday," she said darkly to Michael, "you'd go home in a twink, in absolute twink." She moved onwards, pushing John and Barbara. Jane and Michael knew that she had relented and followed, wondering what a twink was. Suddenly, Jane noticed that they were going in the wrong direction. "But Mary Poppins, I thought you said gingerbread. This isn't the way to Green, Brown, and Johnson's, where we always get it," she began, and stopped because of Mary Poppins' face. "Am I doing the shopping, or are you?" Mary Poppins inquired. "You," said Jane in a very small voice. "Oh, really? I thought it was the other way around," said Mary Poppins with a scornful laugh. She gave the perambulator a little twist with her hand, and it turned a corner and drew up suddenly. Jane and Michael, stopping abruptly behind it, found themselves outside the most curious shop they had ever seen. It was very small and very dingy. Faded loops of colored paper hung in the windows, and on the shelves were shabby little boxes of sherbet, old licorice sticks, and very withered, very hard apples on a stick. There was a small dark doorway between the windows, and through this Mary Poppins propelled the perambulator while Jane and Michael followed at her heels. Inside the shop they could see dimly the glass-topped counter that ran round three sides of it, and in the case under the glass were rows and rows of dark, dried gingerbread, each slab so studded with gilt stars that the shop itself seemed to be faintly lit by them. Jane and Michael glanced round to find out what kind of a person was to serve them, and were very surprised when Mary Poppins called out, "Fanny, Annie, where are you?" Her voice seemed to echo back to them from each dark wall of the shop. And as she called, two of the largest people the children had ever seen rose from behind the counter and shook hands with Mary Poppins. The huge women then leant down over the counter and said, "How do you do?" said in voices as large as themselves, and shook hands with Jane and Michael. "Fanny's my name," said one of them. "My rheumatism is about the same. Thank you for asking." She spoke very mournfully, as though she were unused to such a courteous greeting. "It's a lovely day," began Jane politely to the other sister, who kept Jane's hand imprisoned for almost a minute in her huge grasp. "I'm Annie," she reformed them miserably, "and handsome is as handsome does." Jane and Michael thought that both the sisters had a very odd way of expressing themselves, but they had not time to be surprised for long, for Miss Fanny and Miss Annie were reaching out their long arms to the perambulator. Each shook hands solemnly with one of the twins, who were now so astonished that they began to cry. Now, what's this?" "Oh, now, what's this?" A high, thin, crackly little voice came from the back of the shop. At the sound of it, the expression on the faces of Miss Fanny and Miss Annie, sad before, came even sadder. They seemed frightened and ill at ease, and somehow Jane and Michael realized that the two huge sisters were wishing that they were much smaller and less conspicuous. "What's all this I hear?" cried the curious, high little voice coming near. And presently round the corner of the glass case, the owner of it appeared. She was as small as her voice, and as crackly, and to the children she seemed to be older than anything in the world, with her wispy hair and her stick-like legs, and her wizened, wrinkled little face. But in spite of this, she ran towards them, as lightly and as gaily as though she were still a young girl. Now, well, I do declare, bless me, if it isn't Mary Poppins with John and Barbara Banks. What, Jane and Michael too? Well, isn't this a nice surprise for me? I assure you I haven't been so surprised since Christopher Columbus discovered America. Truly I haven't." She smiled delightedly as she came to greet them, and her feet made little dancing movements inside the tiny elastic-sided boots. She ran to the perambulator and rocked it gently, crooking her thin, twisted old fingers at John and Barbara, until they stopped crying and began to laugh. "That's better," she said, cackling gaily. Then, here she is with the twins in their crib or carriage. Then she did a very odd thing. She broke off 2 of her fingers and gave 1 each to John and Barbara. And the oddest part of it was that in the space left by the broken off fingers, 2 new ones grew at once. Jane and Michael clearly saw it happen. "Only barley sugar, can't possibly hurt 'em," said the old lady to Mary Poppins. "Anything you give them, Mrs. Corry, could only do them good," said Mary Poppins, with most surprising courtesy. "What a pity," Michael said, he couldn't help saying, "that they weren't peppermint bars." "Well, they are sometimes," said Mrs. Corry gleefully, "and very good they taste too. I often nibble them myself if I can't sleep at night. Splendid for the digestion." "What will they be next time?" asked Jane, looking at Mrs. Corry's fingers with interest. "Ah," said Mrs. Corry, "that's just the question. I never know from day to day what they will be. I take the chance, my dear, as I hear William the Conqueror say to his mother when she advised him not to go conquering England." "You must be very old," said Jane, sighing enviously and wondering if she would ever be able to remember what Mrs. Corry remembered. Mrs. Corry flung back her wispy little head and shrieked with laughter. "Old," she said, "why, I'm quite a chicken compared to my grandmother. Now, there's an old woman, if you like. Still, I go back a good way. I remember the time when they were making this world. Anyway, and I was well out of my teens then. My goodness, that was a to-do, I can tell you." She broke off suddenly, screwing up her little eyes at the children. "But dearie me, here I am running on, and you not being served. I suppose, my dear," she turned to Mary Poppins, whom she appeared to know very well, "I suppose you've all come for some gingerbread." "That's right, Mrs. Corry," said Mary Poppins politely. "Good. Have Fanny and Annie given you any?" She looked at Jane and Michael as she said this. Jane shook her head. 2 hushed voices came from behind the counter. "No, Mother," said Miss Fanny meekly. "We were just going to, Mother," began Miss Annie in a frightened whisper. At that, Mrs. Corry drew herself up to her full height and regarded her gigantic daughters furiously. She then said in a soft, fierce, terrifying voice, "Just going to? Oh, indeed, that is very interesting. And who, may I ask, Annie, gave you permission to give away my gingerbread?" "Nobody, Mother, and I didn't give it away. I only thought—" "You only thought? That is very kind of you, but I will thank you not to think. I will thank you not to think. I can do all the thinking that is necessary here," said Mrs. Corry in her soft, terrible voice. Then she burst into a harsh cackle of laughter. Look at her cowardly custard cry-baby," she shrieked, pointing her naughty finger at her daughter. Jane and Michael turned and saw large tears coursing down Miss Annie's face. But they did not like to say anything, for, in spite of her tininess, Mrs. Corry made them feel rather small and frightened. But just as soon as Mrs. Corry looked the other way, Jane seized the opportunity to offer Miss Annie her handkerchief. A huge tear completely drenched it, and Miss Annie, with a grateful look, wrung it out before she returned it to Jane. "And you, Fanny, did you think too, I wonder?" The little high voice was now directed at the other daughter. "No, Mother," said Miss Fanny, trembling. "Just as well for you. Open that case." With frightened, fumbling fingers, Miss Fanny opened the glass case. "Now, my darlings," said Miss Corry, in quite a different voice. She smiled and beckoned so sweetly to Jane and Michael that they were ashamed of having been frightened of her, and felt that she must be very nice after all. "Won't you come and take your pick, my lambs? It's a special recipe today, one I got from Alfred the Great. He was a very good cook, I remember, though he did once burn the cakes. How many?" Jane and Michael looked at Mary Poppins. 4 each, she said. "That's 12. 1 dozen." "I'll make it a baker's dozen. Take 13, said Mrs. Corry cheerfully. So Jane and Michael chose 13 slabs of gingerbread, each with its gilt pepper star. Their arms were piled up with the delicious dark cakes. Michael could not resist nibbling a corner of one of them. "Good?" squeaked Mrs. Corry, and then he nodded, and she picked up her skirts, did a few steps of the Highland fling for pure pleasure. "Hooray, hooray, splendid hooray," she cried in her little shrill voice. Then she came to a standstill, and her face grew serious. "But remember, I'm not giving them away. I must be paid. The price is 3 pence for each of you." Mary Poppins opened her purse, took out 3 penny bits. She gave 1 each to Jane and Michael. "Now," said Mrs. Corry, "stick 'em on my coat. That's where they all go." They looked closely at her long black coat, and sure enough, they found that it was studded with 3 penny bits, as a coster's coat is with pearl buttons. "Come along, stick 'em on," repeated Mrs. Corry, rubbing her hands with pleasant expectation. "You'll find they won't drop off." Mary Poppins stepped forward and pressed her 3 penny bit against the collar of Mrs. Corry's coat. To the surprise of Jane and Michael, it stuck. Then they put theirs on, Jane's on the right shoulder and Michael's on the front of the hem. Theirs stuck too. "How extraordinary," said Jane. "Not at all, my dear," said Mrs. Corry, chuckling. "Or rather, not so extraordinary as other things I could mention." And she winked largely at Mary Poppins. "I'm afraid we must be off now, Mrs. Corry," said Mary Poppins. "There is baked custard for lunch, and I must be home in time to make it." "But Mrs. Brill—" "A poor cook?" inquired Mrs. Corry, interrupting. "Poor," said Mary Poppins contemptuously. "That's not the word." "Ah," Mrs. Corry put her finger alongside her nose and looked very wise. Then she said, "Well, my dear Mary Poppins, it has been a very pleasant visit, and I am sure my girls have enjoyed it as much as I have." She nodded in the direction of her 2 large, mournful daughters. "And you'll come again soon, won't you, with Michael and Jane and the babies? Now, are you sure you can carry the gingerbread?" she continued, turning to Michael and Jane. They nodded. Mrs. Corry drew closer to them, with a curious, important, inquisitive look on her face. "I wonder," she said dreamily, "what will you do with the paper stars?" "Oh, we'll keep them," said Jane. "We always do." "Ah, you keep them. And I wonder where you keep them." Mrs. Corry's eyes were half closed, and she looked more inquisitive than ever. "Well," Jane began, "mine are all under my handkerchiefs in the top left-hand drawer, and—" "Mine are all in a shoebox on the bottom shelf of the wardrobe," said Michael. "Top left-hand drawer and shoebox in the wardrobe," said Mrs. Corry thoughtfully, as though she were committing the words to memory. Then she gave Mary Poppins a long look and nodded her head slightly. Mary Poppins nodded slightly in return. It seemed as if some secret had passed between them. Well, that's where we're going to have to stop for today. I couldn't figure out where the best place was to end that for today, but we will finish next time, the second half of chapter 8. All right, until then, bye.